Two of our European visitors for this week who've been here working on research collaborations this week. And we're starting with Dejan Zec from the Institute for the Recent History of Serbia, who is in his daily job working on what it says on the tin, the history of Serbia, but who's recently produced a book with a co-author on sport in Serbia, and it's certainly his personal interest in terms of what's going on. He's in an ideal situation. He works in a research institute with no undergraduates, no postgraduates, nothing. All he does all day is research. And what a pleasure that is. Wow. Something that's just so lucky.
Okay, thank you, Dave. Thank you very much for inviting me here in Peru. Today I'll talk about a research of mine that I've conducted recently, in the last year, and it's concerning Serbia-British sporting contacts during World War I. And I'll start with a brief introduction about sporting contacts between the British and the Serbs in the period prior to the First World War, and then we'll continue on to what was going on during the war. Now, early contacts between Serbs and the British were sporadic and rare, but during the second half of the 19th century, numerous British journalists, priests, archaeologists, scientists, benefactors and adventurers visited Serbia and transferred impressions of their exotic Balkan journeys to the general public in the United Kingdom, making this part of the world a bit more familiar and helping to break down the negative preconceptions about the Balkans. At the same time, a wider interest for investing the British capital in Serbia also appeared. In 1903, a violent coup occurred in Serbia and Serbian King Alexander I was assassinated, and that resulted in the break-off of the diplomatic relations and the growth of anti-Serbian sentiment in the British public, as regicide was seen as something totally unacceptable. In the years between 1906 and diplomatic relations between the two countries were re-established in 1906 after great efforts were made by the Serbian politicians and at the great cost of major internal political turbulences within Serbia. In the years between 1906 and 1914, the ties got stronger, but certain mutual distrust and negative sentiment could still be sensed in the general public of both nations. The final and decisive shift in these negative stereotypes occurred only during the First World War, when two nations stood together in joint armed struggle against the powerful enemy. Englishmen, and I quote on this, Englishmen are known to be great devotees of sport, wrote Milenko Arsovic, who was an army officer and a keen sports enthusiast back in 1911, thus summarizing the average Serb's first thought about the average Briton in the beginning of the 20th century. In Serbian public of the time, sport was presented as a phenomenon that stood in the very center of what Serbs considered to be a British way of life, and sometimes even referred to as the British ideology. And those observations, even if they seem a bit naive today, represent reflections of an educated Serb on a foreign and unfamiliar nation, basically. Love for sports was linked with what was considered to be social, political, and even biological characteristics of the British. Parallels were even made between the very well-developed sporting life in the United Kingdom and its obvious political, economic, and military achievements, and it was in a way suggested that Serbs should take British as positive role models when pursuing their political and other goals. No problem. Okay. Serbian advocates of the British sporting practices notice one very important thing, and basically true thing, and that is that the British sport is much more interesting than German or Swedish gymnastics, which were somewhat modified, of course, practiced in Serbian schools. British sporting idealism, or at least what Serbs consider it to be, was at the very beginning of the 20th century accepted as a lodestar by several Serbian sporting enthusiasts, especially concerning football. Those people were very influential, despite the fact there were actually only a few of them. Their general background usually included several years living in the UK, either for education or for business. Also, some of them got in contact with British expat communities while living in major cities of Central Europe. Milan Baj, the guy on the right, who was educated in the United Kingdom, unfortunately I didn't manage to find more information about him because I tried to contact his family to see whether he has nothing more about him. He was educated in the United Kingdom, and he was one of the founders of the first Serbian football club back in 1903. And he was considered to be one of the best footballers of his generation, and his contribution to the Serbian game was tremendous, because he used his authority and football knowledge acquired in the United Kingdom to improve the game in both technical and tactical sense. Baj insisted that Serbian football clubs should be organized the same way they were in the United Kingdom, which meant that they had to be independent from any nationalist political organizations and immune to political and propaganda impacts. In 1903, and that is his biggest achievement, he translated and published FA football rules, which, thanks to his effort, became widely accepted across Serbia, and later on, after the war and Yugoslavia was created, they were accepted by the Yugoslav FA. And you can see there's translation of British football rules from 1913. Another thing worth mentioning is the indirect British influence on the development of Serbian tennis, and the important role of Slavko Grujic, the guy over here, in the sporting history of Belgrade and introduction of tennis. Grujic used to be a Serbian diplomatic representative in London in the years prior to the First World War, and got acquainted with tennis while serving in the United Kingdom. And the back garden of his Belgrade home became the first gathering place of the Serbian tennis devotees, a place where first simple tennis court in the land was built. One of the biggest practical problems for all the sporting enthusiasts in Serbia at the very beginning of the 20th century was the issue of acquisition of the adequate sporting equipment: jerseys, shorts, shoes, balls, rackets, skates, skis, other sporting goods. They were not produced in Serbia, and importing them was actually very expensive. However, in the early 20th century, trading routes were established and sporting equipment finally started to arrive in Serbia. Interestingly, Serbs highly appreciated British sporting products, and soon they were available to buy. Through cities like Vienna and Zagreb, quality sporting goods, for instance, I managed to find that Schlesinger sporting goods were being sold in Serbia at that time. Especially British tennis rackets and footballs became widely accessible. Still, they were very expensive and reserved for wealthier buyers alone. And often would someone who would go to the UK, whether on business or for any other purpose, would buy and bring equipment back to Serbia upon someone's request. And one of those people, and it is actually a very interesting story, was Serbian Foreign Minister, the guy seen over here, called Stojan Novakovic, who brought a pair of football boots and a leather football to his grandson in Belgrade from his diplomatic visit to London in 1913, where he actually signed a peace treaty in the behalf of Serbia, ending the Second Balkan War. This football he brought back to Belgrade was branded Lady. I did manage to find more data about that particular brand, but it was described as the most beautiful football ever seen in Serbia, and matches of Slavia Football Club, where Novakovic's grandson was a goalkeeper, saw a massive increase of spectators who just wanted to see the beautiful British leather football. And I actually managed to find a photograph of this football team, and this is actually football. Actually, the first training session when people interested in football heard, wow, a new ball had arrived from London, actually saw several hundred people just appearing to see the football. Now let's move to the war. Now, Serbia somehow managed to defend itself from the Austro-Hungarian attacks in 1914, but it was pretty much clear that it will not be able to withstand further advances without the help from the Allies. So in early 1915, the first members of British, French and Russian military missions began to arrive in Serbia, and they were mostly members of medical corps and engineers. A British military mission led by Commander Hubert S. Cardale, the guy here seen in Serbian uniform, and later led by Admiral Ernst Trubridge, the gentleman on the right, numbered approximately 50 people, and they were mostly engineers, marines, and they were sent to help Serbs to defend the riverbanks from Austrian vessels. And among the troops sent to Serbia to help establish the defense of Belgrade, especially among the British, one could notice several skilled football players who spent their free time by, and I quote, kicking the ball around the cannons. In a very short time, they attracted the attention of both Serbian soldiers and the citizens of Belgrade, especially young boys who observed them with great interest. In order to help the people of Belgrade to overcome the difficulties of living in an attacked and bombarded city, the Allied soldiers proposed the Serbians to arrange an international football match, and that match holds a very special place in the Serbian football history and was of great importance in the process of raising the Serbian-British sporting relations to a higher level. On Sunday, 23rd of May 1915, at the initiative of the British military mission, Belgrade witnessed one football match being played at 5 o'clock in the afternoon in the BSK football ground, and that was the largest football ground, or let's call it football ground, in Belgrade. It was the best one, yeah, and one could accommodate the biggest crowd. The combined team of Belgrade football clubs and foreigners played the match. The team of foreigners was comprised of members of Allied military and medical missions in Serbia, mostly British naval gunmen, and unfortunately their names are not recorded in Serbian press or Serbian documents. I've been trying to find out more. I've been visiting forums and regimental heritage websites, but nothing of them. I managed to find out that Admiral Trubridge had a personal diary, but it's privately kept, it's not published. Hopefully someday, who knows. Belgrade team was comprised of youngsters who played for Belgrade football clubs before the war and who were yet not conscripted in the army. Around 300 people turned up to see the match, and all the revenue from sold tickets was intended to the Serbian Red Cross. The match itself was pretty even, but in the end the final result was 3-1 for the Belgrade team. Now this photograph was taken prior to this match, and these three players who played, they were 16 or 17 at the time, actually became very famous footballers in the post-war Yugoslavia, and actually this guy on the left, called Mihajlo Andrejević, even became, I think, vice chairman of FIFA in 1950s, 1960s, and a very close personal friend to Stanley Rice. Now the match made a very strong impression on both the participants and spectators, and the rematch was scheduled for next week. And the second match caused even bigger public interest. The crowd was even more numerous than the first match, and many foreigners attended the game as well. The Belgrade team took an early lead of 1-0 when the match was abruptly interrupted. As the match got more and more spirited and the audience started to relax and enjoy, the Austro-Hungarian soldiers stationed on one of the monitors cruising the Danube noticed a large live target and opened fire. And after the first grenades fell very near the stadium, the players and the audience just dispersed. Luckily, because later on some of the grenades actually hit the stadium and damaged it pretty badly. And after disruption like this, the football matches were no longer played in Belgrade, and the danger for players and the audience was simply too big. In autumn and winter of 1915, Serbian army was crushed by the enemy and was forced to retreat. And only about 150,000 soldiers from the initially drafted 700,000 were able to reach safety of the Allied-controlled Mediterranean ports in January 1916. Serbian soldiers who managed to survive were stationed in Corfu and Bizet, and French and British doctors looked after them through their recovery. Those doctors were very much credited for encouraging Serbian soldiers to engage in sporting activities, which was very beneficial for their health. Now, Serbs were encouraged to swim and bathe in the sea and to do light gymnastics, and we actually have several saved pictures. These are Serbian soldiers bathing in the Bay of Corfu, and these are Serbian gymnasts in Northern Africa. It was actually, this picture was made later on in 1917. I think they were actually even participating in some sort of inter-allied gymnastics show at the time. One of the effects of the exodus of Serbian soldiers to Corfu in Africa was the fact that they were now mingling with foreigners and gradually got acquainted with different cultures and ways of life. Now, it's easy for soldiers to drink and play cards, of course, it's something they all know how to do, but for the vast majority of Serbian soldiers who were peasants in peacetime, joint life in Allied camps represented the opportunity to see sports being played for the first time in their lives. A comment made by a Serbian soldier who saw a rugby match for the first time says a lot about the intensity of the experience. I'm reading a quote now. The relentless noise reaches us from the other side because there is a rugby match today between the English and French sailors. The opponents are furiously strangling each other, beating each other dully, stumbling and rolling on the ground in dozens while the crowd is howling. A group of soldiers is watching the furious players, and one of them said, "Look at them bastards, they're smothering one another just like us and the Bulgarians. They wouldn't think of it if they had crossed Albania. Yeah, they're well fed and wild." So you can imagine, seeing something like that for the first time. I don't know, a person who probably never travelled outside his village before. Despite the initial reservations, Serbs soon tried to get involved. They were willing to learn, and actually they were willing to oppose much more experienced allied sporting teams. Now, just 3 months after coming to Corfu, a Serbian football team was formed, with an aim to show the allies, the Greeks, British and French, that, and I quote, "Serbian army still has vitality and the Serbs are not just good soldiers but good sportsmen as well." In March 1916, 15 of the best footballers among the Serbian soldiers and refugees in Corfu gathered, regardless of the units or the clubs that played before the war, and they were all given 1 month leave of duty in order to prepare well for the matches against the teams of the Allied armies. The Allied soldiers actually attended the training sessions of those Serbian footballers and caused immense sense of pride to the Serbs. And one of the Serbian footballers actually later on wrote about the event, I quote, "Many of the passers-by and especially our allies watched with admiration agile Serbian soldiers training. They admired our vitality, which was not lost in the terrible retreat, and wondered, especially the English, how the hell we Serbs even knew about the game of theirs." Serbian football team in Corfu played 3 matches in spring of 1916 against Greeks, French and Britons. They won the first match 4-0 and they won second match 6-0. And the final, the most difficult Serbian opponent were the British, of course. That game was the least dynamic out of all played in Corfu, and according to the participants and their later recollections, the British played a game of short passes and the Serbs marked them well. And the only goal of the match was scored when the British centre-half made a strike from the distance of 40 metres and the ball slipped away from the goalkeeper's hands into the net. Of course, losers usually tend to be very creative when finding out reasons why they've lost, sure, probably was like this. And soon after the match was played, the Serbian team was disbanded, because the vast majority of the army were transferred to Salonika. Two important things came out of this entire event. The Serbs learned a lot about the game, and also Serbs made themselves feel very proud because of the achieved results, which had tremendous impact on the morale of the troops. Now let's move to the Salonika front. Now, the initial contacts between the Serbs and the British established in Serbia and in Corfu were almost negligible when compared to those that happened in the Thessaloniki area. The situation in which such a large number of people were situated in such a geographically small space, and there were approximately 600,000 Allied soldiers cramped in a very, very small area, especially when they are in combat environment, led to an extraordinary social dynamics. The worldviews of those who found themselves there, which had undoubtedly been very diverse prior to the war, were moving closer to one another because of intensive socializing, common experiences of the hardships of military life, and common fears and worries. One could often see the Serbian, French and British soldiers spending time together, getting drunk in the taverns of Thessaloniki, singing British, Serbian or French songs, playing cards, dancing, or even visiting brothels together. And just like anywhere else where the British troops were stationed, the British on the Salonika front spent a considerable part of their spare time organizing sporting competitions and matches. Now, the Serbs were noticing that the British love for sports, especially football especially, and perceived it still as a passion that they did not entirely understand. One Serbian soldier wrote in his diary, and I quote, "Another day goes as we are waiting for the news. Near us are some English rear camps. We go to them, listen to their music, and watch them play football, those passionate sportsmen. They probably imagine heaven as a place where there's always enough time and place for all possible sports, and football in particular." So it was a very strong impression of him. Later on, I found out in the diary of this guy, they actually stole a ball from a British camp and tried to play it themselves, but were not very successful. Many Serbian officers and soldiers attended British military band's concerts that were held at Thessaloniki's White Tower almost every week, the British exhibitions, theatre performances and sporting events. Some of them attended by duty, but some attended so as to become better acquainted with the British culture and way of life. And for instance, a big Christmas celebration and sporting competition in 1916 at the British camp near the Serbian sector of the front was attended by several dozens of Serbian officers, soldiers and their officials. The head of Serbian delegation was General Miloš Vasić, then in charge of the Serbian Third Army Corps. And Vasić had an opportunity to attend a tug-of-war competition, several boxing matches, and one football match. And little by little, sport became a part of everyday life of the Serbian troops on the Salonika front. Copying their new British and French friends, the Serbs started to practice sport while resting and fighting. This is this Christmas Day sporting events and yeah, this guy in the middle, the chubby guy, that's General Miloš Vasić, and this is the football match he saw, thanks to the Imperial War Museum. The first proper sports team, Serbian sports team in the Salonika front was formed in autumn of 1916 within the bakery company of the Serbian Army's Drina division, and its disciplinary sergeant Vladeta Popović, who was retired from the front line with both of his legs heavily wounded, introduced football to his company's obligatory activities. That decision of his was not initially met with much enthusiasm, but soon, after only 3 months of training, the new football players of the Drina Division Bakery Company were winning games against the well-trained military teams of the British, French and Italians. The Serbian footballers' success did not go unnoticed, and soon the Allies officers proposed that this team should be sent outside the Thessaloniki area to play against stronger Allied football teams for propaganda purposes. But the Serbian High Command did not find this proposition to be worthy of reconsidering. Following the success of the team of Serbian bakers in November 1916, a football club called Napredak, or Advance, was formed on the Thessaloniki front, and it has three sections. It had three sections, or to be more precise, three different football teams. Napredak played its first matches in January 1916. They managed to beat the French Chauffeur Company by 10 goals to nil. And according to the testimonies of those who participated, the toughest opponent was the British military team from Kalamaria. In February 1917, 2 matches were played between the two teams. In the first match, the British were victorious and won with the result of 3-2, while in the rematch, Serbs managed to win by 2-1. And this is the photograph of this Serbian advance team, and this is the photograph of the match between Serbs and the British. Later on, occasionally, friendly matches between the Allied military teams, especially Serbs and British, were continually played until the breakthrough on the Salonika front, but little evidence of them, unfortunately, had survived. It is, however, evident that in the period of a little longer than 2 years during which the Serbs in the Thessaloniki area lived surrounded by the Allies, the game of football had become one of their favourite pastimes. The Serbs got to know the game well and fell in love with it, and a big credit for that must go to the British soldier on the front. And to conclude, considering the fact that the sporting competition, especially the competitive team sports as football or rugby, were at the beginning of the 20th century an integral part of the cultural living of the British and were enthusiastically practiced in the army, the Serbs had the opportunity to watch the sporting matches during the joint social activities. At first, the majority just observed in wonder and made comments about the childish behaviour of British soldiers, but soon enough, some of the Serbs actually dared to step in and take part. A very important role in this process belonged to those Serbian soldiers and officers who had some sporting experience from the pre-war years and had the courage to compete with the British footballers and other athletes. They had shown to their allies that there is a sporting spirit in Serbia which had the potential to fully develop later on, and to their countrymen who have not had any sporting experience, that sport was a normal part of everyday life in Europe and not just something to be ashamed of, but rather to be proud of. It is fair to say that the contacts made during the war heavily influenced the rapid post-war development of sports in Serbia and Yugoslavia. Thank you very much.